That's something you'll never take, no debate. It's gotta be in you to endure the hate and elevate. If I love you, then we gon' eat, even if we share the plate. Strive for greatness and try to be more like Harris Bank, young exec. Whoever at the top, we coming next. Don't care what it is, we conquer all with no regrets. It's no wonder when we come on your set, they show respect. I don't overstep, we taking off like Boeing jets. You know the rep, and if you don't, you better ask about me. I done made it to that skyline, I seen out of Abla housing. Got goals and accomplishments, the new chick I got arousing. She say she don't drink it yet, every cup I pour she downing. Maybe cause she think I'm scouting every season, cuffing season. I won't do you dirty unless you take me to the cleaners. I'll be sure to show each and every reason before I leave you. Guaranteed to make you rethink your actions and start believing I got. That's something no one.
Yes, I'm Dr. Malik Rahim. I'm a clinical assistant professor at Wilberforce University. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about racial identity development. And that way counselors and students can better understand some of the things that their clients might be going through or them themselves might be going through as they navigate this developmental process. Excuse the hat right now with the COVID-19. It's supposed to be baseball season. I'm missing my Chicago White Sox. Yes, I'm here in the beautiful city of Chicago. So right now I'm be coming to you and talking to you about racial identity, but I just had to have some kind of connection with my team that's supposed to be out there playing. There's quite a few racial identity development models, and unlike the other developmental models that talk about the process of becoming a human being, as far as like the man, as far as Piaget, Erickson, Freud, those are more the more known models as far as developmental models. They're more linear. Okay, with the racial identity development model, they're not as linear. They're more circular, to where a person could go in and out and kind of get moved back and forth in different stages. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the different models, and there are several different racial identity models, including Atkinson's racial identity model, racial and cultural identity model, the Cross and Fagan Smith model of Black racial identity, and Helms model of white racial identity. There's the Cross Negressence racial identity model. There's a Rowe Bennett and Atkinson white racial consciousness model. There's also the Ferdman and Gallegos model of Latino identity development. And there's Kim's Asian American identity development model. And then there's also Horse's perspective on American Indian identity development. And I'm going to take each of those in kind of a series and just kind of make this a series to where it's like each of them have their own personal video, to where you can kind of go through them and digest them. So today I'm going to basically talk about Atkinson, Morton, and Sue's racial and cultural identity development model, and Cross and Fagan Smith's model of Black identity development. I like to say that all these racial identity development models all came from the model of Negressence from Cross in 1971. And what that developmental model is basically about is the process of becoming Black, becoming comfortable with your Blackness, your Black consciousness. And so first formed in 1979, the Atkinson, Morton, and Sue racial identity and cultural identity development came around. It's been revised a couple of times. The final revision is in 1998. And it's a 5-stage model, and it has served as a foundation for the variety of racial and ethnic identity development models to follow. Okay. So I'm going to kind of talk about that one and go through the stages of those, and hopefully be able to come up with some good examples of what you might, some famous characters either in history or in pop culture that you can identify with, to kind of see, what someone stereotypically will look like in that stage. Just because I've named somebody don't necessarily mean that all people that's in this stage, all individuals in this stage will look and behave that way, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. The first process of this lecture is going to be, like I said, although it's circular, I'm going to be talking more in line to where it's linear, because I think that's what I found is easiest for my students to be able to understand if I discuss it like it's linear, with the understanding that it's not linear, that it can be circular, and that people move back and forth. So let's begin. First stage you have is conformity. And with conformity, the individual identifies with white culture. The individual learn and assume stereotypes and has no inkling to identity or learn about their own racial or ethnic heritage. They're oblivious to the whole concept of race. They don't think race is an important factor. They go by the concept that we're all Americans. We're humans. I don't see race. I don't understand why people are focused on race. They want to assimilate so much into the dominant society because they look at the dominant society, white society, as being superior to Black society. They have only a superficial identity with Black culture. So that's person that's in the conformity stage. I think a lot of the people I'm going to be naming are going to be similar throughout a lot of the identity models. And I like to say that probably the first person I'll come up with is the pop culture famous person is Carlton Banks from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And the thing about Carlton Banks is that although his character, I like to think of, developed over the time of the show, initially in the show, and a great portion of the show, part of the joke was that he didn't identify with Black culture. That a lot of the things that he looked at was kind of, affiliated with white culture. So the thing is that because of his growing up and his atmosphere on where he lived, he identified as white culture, and he looked at, for the most part, that everything that his cousin Will, who in the show had a strong Black consciousness, in a sense, he looked at it as being inferior and kind of used the term ghetto. And that's what happens with a person that's in conformity. They kind of identify with white culture, and they kind of formulate into that concept that their own racial or ethnic background is inferior, and the dominant one is the superior one, and they want to assimilate into that because that's the standard that they've been given. Then what will happen is, like I said, I'm described like it's linear. Then what happened is dissonance. And what dissonance is that all the things that they thought they knew, they get new information that shows that something's not right. So the person encounters a catalyst for one to question white culture and begin an interest in one's own racial or ethnic group. I'd say a good thing, that an example of that is again with the show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. What happened was that there was an episode where, it was a couple of episodes I could come up with, but this episode was Will and Carlton got arrested for driving the partner's car to, I want to say, Las Vegas. And one of the things that formulated was, at the end of the show, Will and Carlton was having a discussion of, why did they get pulled over? And Will was trying to explain to him that the primary reason that they got pulled over because there were two young Black males in a very expensive car. And Carlton was saying, no, it was justified for the officers to pull us over because we were going too slow. We were driving so slow, and that brought suspicions upon us. And that's one of the reasons that we was pulled over. Well, Will got frustrated and told him he needs to wake up, and walked out. And Carlton kept repeating it in his mind, kind of softly, I would pull this over. I know that was the real reason we got pulled over. And then soon after that, in the scene, Uncle Phil walks in. And when Uncle Phil walks in, he asks his son, Carlton, why are you still up? And Carlton looks at his dad and says, Dad, um, it was right for us to get pulled over, wasn't it? And basically, it wasn't because of race. Now, one of the exact terms that he, the lines that he used in the show, but in essence, that's kind of what it was about. That looking for some kind of vindication that it wasn't about race; it was about something else. The officers was justified, and unfortunately for Carlton, Uncle Phil couldn't, validate that theory to him. He kind of said, I asked myself that over and over again when I was your age. So the thing is that that's the dissonance that, maybe all the things that I believed that race wasn't important, race wasn't a matter, maybe all the things that I believe aren't really there. Is a misnomer. I don't, is a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance going on. And so what happens is that causes a rift, and he start investigating his own racial or ethnic identity. The next thing is in the stage is called resistance and emergence. And in the resistance and emergence stage, the individual withdraws from white culture to immerse himself into his own racial or ethnic exploration in the efforts to define a new identity. So they'll dig into Black culture. So it's kind of like the complete opposite of the conformity stage. And what the person would do is they'll go into it and they'll start looking for more of a Black consciousness, trying to find out, who am I really? What is this whole construct called race? And then so what they'll start doing is they'll start looking into that. And as they start looking into that, what they'll start doing is start immersing themselves more and more into a Black consciousness and Black culture. And one of the things that happens is that they'll become to the point to where it's like they're so into the Black culture that where they become so anti or against white culture or the mainstream culture. So as they develop, what will happen is the introspection. That's the next stage, introspection. And what introspection is when the individual actually seeks to integrate the redefined identity into the dominant culture without compromising aspects of their own racial or ethnic identity. And somewhere in between, I gotta make note of this, somewhere between the resistance and emergence stage and the introspection stage, the person also gets to the point to where they grow impatient with other people of Black identity or of African descent. They grow impatient with them who do not have the same consciousness as them. So they'll start looking at them as being inferior, and stages that they probably just recently left, they'll look at them as being inferior and that they don't have as much knowledge as them on the aspects of the world. So they'll start, kind of in less, degrading them, kind of looking at them as, you're not the same, you're inferior to I am because I'm more Black than you are, have more Black consciousness than you. So it's like, that's one of the things that happen. Then with the introspection, they start actively seeking to integrate the identified identity into the dominant culture without compromising aspects of his or her own racial ethnic identity. And one of the things is that you'll see them, maybe wearing particular type of hairstyles, particular type of clothing, finding a way to where they can be what you'll call unapologetically Black and being comfortable and still be able to navigate through white dominant culture. And what happens is, unfortunately, a lot of times in this stage, that's when a lot of issues with mental health start happening, to where that's when the race-based traumas really start happening, because they become more aware of different things like microaggressions when they're in these stages, the resistant immersion and the introspection. They're more cognitive of seeing microaggressions. They possibly would get more racial battle fatigue when they're in this stage, where they feel that they always at battle because of their race. And so they start noticing little subtleties of racism. They start noticing the certain prejudice and discrimination things that are happening to them that are not happening to other people. They start seeing that they are becoming a focal point. That's one of the reasons, as they try to navigate and redefine their identity and trying to become comfortable with not only their blackness, because they become comfortable with their blackness, with their own consciousness, but they try to figure out ways to navigate it into the dominant culture. Synergistic awareness is the final stage, and it's the optimal identity in this model, where the individual is able to identify their wishes, appreciate other cultures, including the dominant culture, and balance all aspects of his or her heritage. So it's like, unfortunately, a lot of people do not actually achieve this because of the different racial traumas that they go through in society. They have a hard time, achieving it. But it's like, as you looked at, some of the probably the more famous people, you would say that actually get to this stage would probably be someone like a El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, to where they went through all 5 of these stages of the model, where they went through the conformity, where they went through the dissonance, where they went through the resistance and immersion, where they went through the introspection, when they went through the synergistic awareness, right? And with their conformity with, of course, with Brother Malcolm, or El Hajj Malik Shabazz, is that when early on he was considered Detroit Red, and he used to sell drugs, and not only sell drugs, he used to pimp women, especially white women, and he would have a relationship with white women on, and actually seek them out because of the white model of the white woman being so beautiful. So he would seek them out. And so what happened is if you know anything about his story, I'm gonna give a brief, synopsis of, Malcolm's story, is that he had several occasions where he had dissonance. I think one of the first, accounts of his dissonance is when he was a young man, I'd say around about 9, where he was in school, and it's like, what happened is that the rite of passage that happens to so many Black males in schools between the ages of 7 and 14. And what happens is that they're actually being told by their teachers that, because, and it's not as overt as what happened to Malcolm, but because of their race, they are not going to make it. Because of their identity, they're not going to make it. And like, now we call it the school to prison pipeline. That's usually the first introduction, where the implicit biases start coming out, and they start watching the young Black males. With Malcolm's situation, because of the time frame that it was in, it was more overt. And so the teacher, informed him that he couldn't become a lawyer, that he should rethink his career aspirations. Although Malcolm was the most intelligent young man in the class, he made the best grades. He was the best as far as being on a debate team, super intellectual. But the teacher, the white teacher, told him that, you should think of another career. Maybe you should become a carpenter because, even Jesus was a carpenter, and that'd be a good career for a black male like you. So it's like what happened is with that is that Malcolm got turned off by the education system. But it's like for all accounts prior to that, he was really into the education system. He was really into education. He really thought of that his race would not be a hindrance to him. But so he was in conformity stage there, and then that dissonance happened to where he was informed that his race, an incident happened where he was informed that his race was an issue. Another key element in the lifespan of Malcolm X is when he was Detroit Red. And as Detroit Red, like I was saying, he was, selling drugs, being with white women, drinking alcohol, selling alcohol, running numbers, and different things like that. And he even kind of like put what they call a perm in his head, a process. So eventually he got arrested and was on trial. And when it got to the phase of the sentencing phase, the two white women who were co-defendants of him and his friend Shorty got a much lesser sentence than they did. And he equates this with the fact that the judge and the prosecutors and the criminal justice system, and he looked at white society as a whole, was punishing him and Shorty because they were sleeping with white women. And it was kind of like a point where they were putting them in their place. So that was the dissonance stage. With the resistance and the emergent stage, is when, everyone that don't know all of Malcolm X history is probably the most familiar with him, is when he got introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, and he became the minister after, after getting out of prison. And with that, he became the national spokesperson, and he became Malcolm X. And you see the metamorphosis of his unapologetic self, the unapologetic Black masculinity of Malcolm X. And as you study his life, from then on, you will see it went through the resistance and the emergent stage where he withdrew from white culture and got into his own racial ethnic exploration and to define a new identity. And then he went to the introspection later on throughout his time at the Nation of Islam. And then when he left, he went through introspection when he was seeking to integrate the redefined identity into the dominant culture without compromising aspects of his racial identity development and his ethnic identity development. So what he started doing, he became what is known as a Pan-African. And he started looking to bring in, a connection between the sufferings of what they call the Afro-Americans, then the African-Americans then, and then now the Africans of the continent. So he started making that connection. And so when he went to Mecca, the famous letter he wrote to his wife was that he saw, that all white people aren't, condemned to be evil because of their skin color. It's something about the concept of whiteness that, especially in the West, that, dictates that hatred and that racism. But he saw Muslims who in America would be identified as being white that treated him and loved him like a brother. And then, of course, the synergistic awareness is where he identified his wishes and appreciate other cultures, including the dominant culture, and balance all aspects of his life and his heritage with who he was. And he didn't look at necessarily that Jewish culture was inferior to his culture. He appreciated, Jewish culture because he had friends who were Jewish. He had associates who were Jewish. Some of his followers were from the Asian American groups, and he had people who were from, West Africa, who, like I said earlier, who would identify as white because they were Arab. So the thing is, he had this whole appreciation because that part of his life started coming out. So the Atkinson, Morton, and Sue model served to be a primary model of a lot of other racial identity theories. The model is basically a progression of an individual as they go through defining their own racial identity. And so the thing is that as counselors, whether we're school counselors, rehabilitation counselors, clinical rehabilitation counselors, clinical mental health counselors, it's very important for us or counselor educators, it's very important for us to kind of have a grasp and understanding of these developmental models, because it helps us to understand not only where our clients are at, but where we are at. So that's the first model I'm going to talk about. And next up will be the Cross and Fagan Smith model of racial identity. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that it covers a lifespan. So thank you. And like I said, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to, talking with you soon.